Hello everyone and welcome to the first round of the FIDE Candidates Tournament in Madrid. In this video we will be going over all of the action that happened today. It was a very exciting round. Liren finally got back into action. So let's have a look at what happened. So as we said before, nobody really knew what to expect from Ding. He qualified to the Candidates Tournament, right? But it was a bit of a weird way as to how he got there. It looked like initially he was not going to get the required amount of games. But then there were some tournaments organized in China. But in any case, he did make it, and he played the very first game with the white pieces against Jan-Nepomniachtchi. So he opened the game with 1 c4, e5, g3, and c6 by black. So black wants to build a big pawn center with the move d5, which is why Ding plays the move knight to f3. He's hitting this pawn on e5, and black has to make a decision. If you play d6, well, then you're sort of giving up on this idea of going d5. Right? So Nepo played the move e4, and now white is basically claiming that this pawn on e4 can become overextended. So knight at d4, d5, takes, and so Nepo takes with the queen, which leaves the pawn on e4 to be a little bit weak. You can also take with the pawn, but then after d3, here we are threatening to take, and once again try to make this pawn weak, and if black takes, well then black has an isolated pawn on d5. So that is really what white is playing for in this line. I've also played this line myself with the black pieces in the World Cup of 2021. In that game I also captured the queen. So knight c2, knight f6, knight c3, queen e5, bishop g2, and knight a6. So black is delaying the development of the bishop, and that's actually, we'll see the point in the game that I had. In that game my opponent played knight e3, and in that game I played bishop c5. So the idea is that if white goes queen c2, for example, now black can just trade on e3 if he wants, or actually we'll go knight b4 first, the queen steps back, now we'll take on e3 and we have bishop f5, right? That's why we need to get rid of that knight on e3. Alright, so Ding castled, and now bishop b7. So finally Nepo is forced to develop his bishop, now knight e3. So here bishop c5 makes less sense. Instead he castled and white played the move a3. So the point behind a3 is that white wants to go b4, put the bishop on b2, put pressure on the queen, maybe b5 in some positions, and also to be able to go queen c2 and not be hit with a knight to b4. So Nepo played rook e8. Now if white goes queen c2, black can play bishop f8, for example, to defend the pawn on e4. So Ding played b4, right, opening up this square for his bishop, knight g4 by Nepo, which does sacrifice the pawn on e4. And I was wondering during the game what Nepo was actually planning if white were to take it. I mean, if you take an e3, we can recapture with the f-pawn. We make sure that this knight is protected. And black definitely has some compensation, but I don't really know if black is enough. And maybe this is what Ding should have gone for. Instead, he plays bishop e2, and now Nepo plays the very direct queen to h5. He's starting checkmate on h2. Now, white maybe should have taken on g4 again. Black is going to recapture. And if you take on e4, I guess Nepo was planning bishop f6, putting pressure on his knight, pressure on this pawn on e2, pressure on this bishop on e4. But I guess one way or another, white should be able to withstand the pressure with a move like f3, h3, and perhaps rook f2. I don't know, but instead of that, Ding played the move h4, which stops the checkmate. Now Nepo goes bishop f6. You still cannot take, because if you take, black will take on c3, and then take the bishop on e4. So instead of that, Ding played queen to c2, putting more pressure over here. But now Nepo took. You don't really want to take with the f-pawn, especially with your pawn on h4, because you really soften up your king side. So Ding decided to take with the d-pawn. Now came bishop f5, defending this pawn over here. And this is where Ding made a serious mistake. He probably should have gone for the move b5, hitting this knight, hitting this pawn over here. And black has a tough decision to make. If you go knight to c5, then we will take on c6, and this pawn here becomes very weak. And if you do take on b5, well, then we just recapture, and this knight is jumping around at d6. This is under attack in some positions. I mean, if rook c8, queen b1 solves all of our problems pretty nicely, and white still has quite a pleasant advantage. But Ding played the move knight a4, which also trades off the bishops, but doesn't really accomplish anything else, and it feels like it's just too slow. And Nepo punished him really nicely for that. He traded the bishops on b2, and then played knight to c7. So he wants to centralize his knight, and on the d5 square, the knight is anchored, which means that it's defended by this pawn, and it cannot be attacked by any of white's pawns, right? We cannot go pawn to c4 or pawn to e4. So knight to c4 was played by Ding. He wants to hop into the d6 square, so rook e6, stopping knight d6, but this rook will also become useful in an attack later on. So rook fd1, reinforcing the knight d6 threat. Now knight d5, taking knight d6 out of the position. And Ding played rook to d4, and now a good move by Nepo, he goes h6. So it looks like, well, he's just making some move for the king, right? Well, his idea is also to go g5, get this trade in, and then if this rook comes to h6, white is simply getting checkmated. So queen d2 by Ding, rook a8 by Nepo, bring another piece into the game, king h2 by Ding. Alright, so you might be wondering, like, what is the idea behind this move? But if black goes g5, he wants to go rook h1, which is why we move the king out of the way. And if we take now on h4, white goes king g1 and is hitting this pawn on h4. So instead of that, Nepo played another very nice move. He goes bishop g4, hitting this pawn on e2. And how do you defend it? Well, you can play rook e1, but now we go g5. And if you go rook h1, now you're not defending this pawn on e2 anymore. So black just takes and has a great position. So that was Nepo's idea. Instead of that, Ding goes for counterplay with knight a5, but now comes the move rook f6 by Nepo. A really nice move. He really timed his moves very nicely. He's hitting this pawn on f2, and it's tough for white to do anything about it. If you go king g1, which is what Ding does, now Nepo play g5. And once again, there's no ideas for rook to h1 anymore. And the problem really is if you take on g5, the rook is going to come to h6 with devastating effect. Just to illustrate real quick what's going to happen, black is going to give a check over here. White only has this defender around his king. What do we do with defenders? Well, we eliminate them with the move bishop h3. And then next up, it's going to be checkmate on the h1 square. So, very tough for white to deal with this. So instead of that, Ding took on b7, but now Nepo took on h4. And here Ding played knight c5 with this allowed pawn to h3. And the position is already beyond safe here. This pawn is going to create devastating threats in case white goes bishop h1. There's a funny line. You can go h2 check. And now something like bishop h3 and bishop g2 was a funny line that I looked at the broadcast. Because if white takes, there's queen and black just checkmates white. So instead of that, Ding took on e4 with the rook. Now black took on g2. He's sacrificing his rook on e8, but once again, he's going after this white king. King g7, and there's nothing white can do. If you take on g2, black is a very nice sequence. We sacrifice the rook on f2, and if you recapture queen h2 check, and wherever you go, you are getting checkmated. So instead of that, Ding played pawn to f4, creating the square for his king. But in the process, you are losing your rook on a1 and the attack rages on. King takes g2, bishop h3 check. If you go with your king to f2, queen f1 is going to be checkmate. And if you take here, then there's going to be queen h1, king g4, h5 check, king g5, and queen h3. You make sure that the king cannot escape. Queen g4 is coming, rook g6. White is simply getting checkmated. And if you go to h2, then there will be queen f1. So Ding resigned, and on the broadcast you could see Ding sitting like this. He was obviously not happy. I mean, losing with white in the very first round is a tough start. I mean, in a tournament where only first place counts. So luckily for him, there's still many more rounds to come back, but he'll have to do better in the next round. So this was the first game to come to an end, and Nepo, he wins the first game and is among the leaders. Now the next game to come to an end was the game between Hikaru-Nakamura and Fabiano Caruana, in which Fabiano opened the game with 1e4. Hikaru stick to his guns with the Berlin defense. Fabiano played the Rue Lopez. And so here the question was like, okay, what is Fabiano going to do? Because the Berlin could be expected from Hikaru. What is a couple options? Is he going to go into this endgame, right, which was long thought to be the main line of the Berlin, right, knight f5. We get into this endgame where white has a majority on the king side, and black has this king on the a, which is a bit of a problem, but black has the two bishops. Alright, so black is generally fine here. White can also go for this move rook to e1, which generally is a bit more quiet. Or the move d3. Bishop c5. Now another main move here is the move c3, which is the move that Hikaru played to beat Levon Aronian in the FIDE Grand Prix to make his way into this candidate tournament, or the trade on c6. And here we get this very original position. White is the slightly better pawn structure, but black has the two bishops. Now you cannot take an e5 because black goes queen d4, hitting f2 and the knight, so black just wins the game. So Fabiano goes knight bd2. Hikaru plays bishop e6, discouraging knight c4 from white. And now once again you cannot take because there will be queen d4 and you lose your knight because black is also threatening checkmate. But here Fabiano castles. So here the pawn on e5 is under attack. You cannot just castle because white just takes and queen d4 does not threaten anything. So Hikaru had to defend the pawn, and he played the move bishop to d6. And now Fabiano played the move knight to b3. And actually, it was pretty funny. During the broadcast, I was reminded that I had some games here with black against Ray Robson in an online blitz match. Now, I don't quite recall what I did in the match. I think I castled, but white always puts this knight on a5, which is a little bit annoying because you cannot kick the knight away with b6, then you hang your pawn on c6, and also your pawn on e5, so you just lose. Right, you just lose. That's how it works at the top level. You're not like, oh, I'm down 2 pawns. No, you just lose. So instead of that, Hikaru played queen e7, now came knight a5, and here black had a bit of a decision to make. He played rook b8, which is fine, but long castles was also an option. But as Arena Crush and I were doing commentary, it felt very dangerous for black. White can play moves like a3, followed by a quick b4, bishop e3 and c4. We're showing this line where white goes b4, and it's difficult for black to really generate any counterplay on the king side. I mean, bishop e3, and all of a sudden after c4, white has enormous threats. c5 is a threat, queen a4 is an idea. So instead of that, Hikaru decided to play more solidly with the move rook to b8, defending this pawn on b7. And now Fabiano played bishop g5, a good move because it's difficult to get rid of this pin. Right, Hikaru played h6, bishop h4, and now you have to decide, like, do you go g5? Well, of course, that weakens your king side, or do you just keep this bishop here? Hikaru decided to play g5, bishop g3, and knight d7 to defend this pawn on e5. Now came the move d4 by Fabiano, putting pressure on the center, and Hikaru decided to just keep the situation in the center as is with the move f6. Alright, so if white takes, we just recapture, and black is completely fine. So Fabiano played queen to d3. He wants to be able to bring this knight back into the game, so Hikaru played h5. He wants to trap this bishop with the move h4, and it's not that easy for white. If you go h3, well, the problem is that black can always go g4, opening up lines towards his king on g1, so you don't really want to do that. If you go h4, well, then after g4, your knight has to go to an awkward square, so that's also not really what you want to do. So Fabiano went for pawn takes e5. Now the point is, if black takes with the pawn, now we can go h4, and if you go g4, we have this nice square on g5, because this pawn is no longer on f6, and white is a very pleasant advantage. So instead of that, Hikaru took with the knight. Now Fabiano decided, like, he can take with the knight or with the bishop, but he decided to take with the bishop. To make sure that his bishop on g3 can never be trapped, Hikaru recaptured, and now knight is c4, hitting this pawn on e5. So Hikaru played rook to d8. So you cannot take because we will just recapture, and your queen on d3 will be under attack. And so white can set this queen out of the way first with something like queen c3, but now we give up the light square bishop. You have to recapture, and after g4, your knight will have to go to an awkward square again, like d2. And here black has a pretty funny move to solve all of his problems. It looks good for black. I mean, we can make progress on the king side, moves like h4 and g3, but the king is still a problem that is unsolved, right? And we cannot go king side castles, we also cannot go queen side castles, but we can play the move king to d7. Put the king on c8 where it's completely safe behind this wall of pawns, and then, you know, we can start pushing these pawns on the king side later on. So that would have been a very nice line for Hikaru, but instead of that, Fabiano plays a better move. He takes on d6. Now black recaptures, and queen to e3. So he's creating a double attack, hitting this pawn on g5 and on a7. So Hikaru plays g4, hitting the knight went back, and now a6, solving the problem of the other pawn. And here Fabiano played the move b3, and here Hikaru made a very weird decision. Right, it felt like he should have had a completely fine position. The bishop is good, he has a nice pawn structure. He's of course a little bit overextended, but that can also be to his advantage with h4. And, you know, black could consider something like king d7, put the king on c7 or c8. But Hikaru, instead of that, went short castles. And as he said in the interview later, he really regretted this move, because now his king always found itself in danger. Fabiano played a very logical f3. He just wants to open up files towards his king and activate his rook. And things are looking tough for Hikaru. He played queen to g7 to defend. Fabiano took. Now, here already black has a tough decision to make. If you take with the bishop, well, then you always have to be careful about this knight jumping to c4, maybe f3 later on. So Hikaru decided to take with the pawn, but this pawn does become a bit of a weakness later on. So Fabiano played rook 81, bringing his rook into the game. And the problem is, if you trade rooks, white is always going to take with the knight. With the knight coming to g3, or the e3 in some cases, it's just a tough defense for black. So Hikaru played d5, but the problem is, after this trade, now the pawns in the center become weak. So Fabiano played rook de1, hitting the pawn on e5, e4 by Hikaru, and now Fabiano does something very instructive again. You want to go c4. and break up these pawns in the center. But the problem is here, black takes on f1, and if you recapture, now we take on c4. And black can always try to trade the queens with a quick queen to d4. So instead of that, Fabiano trades first on f8, black recaptures, and now goes for c4. Because if you take, now we take on e4 with the queen, hit the bishop, this is hanging, and there's no queen d4, because your bishop on e6 will be hanging later on. So rook to e8 by Hikaru to defend. Now Fabiano trades, and knight to f1, a nice move. The knight can come to g3 or to e3, from where it's hitting this pawn. It can jump to f5, can jump to d5. Oh, that was not the move that Hikaru played. He played queen to e5, queen h6, threatening queen g6. So Hikaru played queen g7, and now queen d6, hitting this bishop. And you'll have to make a tough decision as to where you go with the bishop. But if you go to e6, well, then you hang this. That's not a good idea. And if you go to f7, well, you will always have to deal with moves like knight e3, threatening knight f5. So it's really tough. So Hikaru played bishop c6. Now came knight e3. Knight f5 is an idea, or bring this rook into the game. And Hikaru played g3, trying to complicate the position. And here's where Fabiano might have missed a win. He could have played the move rook to f1. And the idea is very simple. We want to go rook f6 and rook g6. And that would just simply win the game. Black simply has no way to defend here. Black can take on h2, but as so often what we do here is that we use this pawn as a shield, where there's no way black can check this king if it's behind the black pawn. And what is black going to do? If you go rook f8 to stop rook f6, now white has knight f5, hitting the queen, and his knight is just jumping around with a ton of threats, and there's simply nothing black can do here. So yeah, this probably would have been a win for Fabiano, but instead of that he takes on g3, also a good move. Now Hikaru plays queen e5, offering the queen trade. Queen g6 check, queen g7, queen d6. So Fabiano is repeating the moves because they were getting closer to time control. And if they reach move 40, they will get an additional hour on the clock. And he feels like, okay, I'm winning, so if I just reach the time control, then I'm going to win the game. So queen e5, now queen h6. He's refusing the repetition. Queen takes g3 and rook f1, because this knight on e3 is defended by the queen. So Hikaru played queen g7. He wants to trade the queens. Queen h4 and queen h7, which was quite a serious mistake. Caruana could have played here queen f4, and I think there's simply no defense for black against knight g4 to f6, where you just fork every single piece. But instead of that, Fabiano gave a check, queen g7 and queen h4. He probably realized his mistake, but so did Hikaru, and he played the move bishop to d7, making sure that this knight cannot jump to g4 or f5. It can also not jump to d5, because now we have queen d4 check. Right, so you don't want to do that. So instead of that, Fabiano goes rook d1. He's preparing the move knight d5, and probably here's where Hikaru made the decisive mistake in the game. It felt like the only move to hang on here was to go rook e7, not an easy move. So after knight d5, you go rook f7, and you still defend against all of the threats. But instead of that, he played the move bishop to e6. Now he allows knight d5, and you think like, okay, now we can trade. But the problem is white recaptures, and this rook is coming to g5 with devastating effect. If you check over here, the white king just goes here. It's perfectly safe. And queen h8 does not trade the queens. We can play rook h5 first. And this king is just completely open. That's why, you know, Hikaru should have never castled kingside. Anyway, instead of that, he played the move rook f8, stopping knight f6. But now Fabiano just captured the pawn on e4. And Hikaru played queen to h6. But once again, this king is just so wide open. Fabiano played rook to e1. Hitting this bishop, and the problem is if you trade on d5, your king is under attack, and if the king steps over, the easiest way for white to win probably is just to take this pawn on b7. I mean, you're up 2 pawns, there should be a way to trade the queens, and then you're just trading down into a winning rook and pawn in game. So rook to d8 was played by Hikaru, so that if white takes, you can take over here. But now Fabiano gave a check on the king. You have to go king f7 because you have to defend this bishop. Now knight f5. If you take, there's queen e7, and you win the rook. So Hikaru played queen f6, but now rook to f1, and there's a ton of problems along the f-file. So he played bishop to d5, but now Fabiano finished the game off very cleanly with knight h6 check. King has to go to g7 and queen g4. The only move you have not to lose the queen is queen g6, but now comes knight f5. You don't want to step into the discovery, so you have to go king h7 and now queen h4. And white is picking up everything. You take on d8, you can take here, but you can also go queen h4 and win the queen. So instead of that, after the move queen g4, Hikaru resigned. So very tough start for him for the candidates. It looked like he had a completely fine position, but really that move cancels started all of his problems. So tough start, but let's see whether he will come back tomorrow. Alright, then the next game to come to an end was the game between Teimour Radjabov and Alireza Firouzja. So Radjabov opened the game with 1d4, knight f6, c4, e6 by Firouzja, and now knight to f3. So d5, knight c3, and here black has a lot of options. Most of them are very solid, like moves like c5, bishop b7, bishop b4, but Firouzja goes for the most combative one, but it does involve some risk. He took on c4, e4, and b5. Now his idea is that if white takes on b5, you take the pawn on e4, so white goes e5 first, knight jumps to d5, and now we take on b5. Right, so it looks good for white, right? Like the pawns are equal, and black has these double pawns on the queen side. Firouzja plays knight to b6, bishop b3, and knight c6. On the flip side, black does have control over this d5 square. Bishop b2 by Radjabov, bishop b7. Now came castles, castles, and knight to c3. Firouzja plays rook to b8 and a3 by Radjabov. He wants to be able to put his queen on c2 and not be bothered with a knight to b4 jump. So Firouzja goes knight a5, queen c2, and knight d5. And Radjabov plays rook to d1. So black can trade on e3, but this does solidify white's center. But on the other hand, if black manages to open up later on with c5, you know, maybe the two bishops will have something to say. So Firouzja could have considered that, but instead of that, he goes bishop to a6. Now bishop d2 by Radjabov, knight to b3, and knight e4. White is hitting this pawn on c4. So black took over here, rook takes. And now, during the broadcast, Aruna Crush and I were thinking that the only move for black to play here was to go knight b6, defend this pawn on c4. But instead of that, he goes knight f4. So it looks like he's just giving up a pawn, but now he unleashed rook takes b2. Right, you cannot really just trade the bishops over here, because you're just down a pawn. The position is quite terrible. But rook takes b2 is a very tricky move. White took, bishop takes, and his rook is under attack. Black's knight is pretty active, and the two bishops also compensate for the fact that he's down in exchange. So rook to c1 by Radjabov. Now here, he could have won back the exchange with knight at d3, but I guess he was worried about queen c2, takes in queen takes c4, and his knight is kind of trapped, but there are ways to solve that problem with the move queen d5, because you also hit the knight on e4, but I can understand that this was not exactly to his liking. So instead of that, he went bishop d5, hitting the knight on e4, now the rook came back to e1 to defend, queen a8, hitting the knight, and queen to c2. Alright, so defending the knight on e4 once more, and now I took the pawn on a3. So he's starting bishop b4, but the thing here is if black manages to consolidate, black should be doing pretty well. Right, let's say white goes back, and rook e3, black can play something like h6, followed by a5, and black has a pretty nice position. Right, we're down in exchange, but we have a pawn. Look at these bishops, they're pretty strong. So black's doing pretty well. But white can create some annoying threats in the meantime. And that's what Radjabov did. He played knight f to g5. And the idea is that if black goes h6, now we go knight f6, check, and checkmate. So black has to do something about it. And if you go pawn g6, now there's knight f6 check, and you also don't want to allow that. So Firouzja, and last but not least, you also don't want to take on e4, because then you give up, you know, really your prettiest piece in the position. So Firouzja played the only move, knight to g6. Alright, so what do we do now? Now Radjabov played h4. His idea is very simple. He wants to go h5, kick this knight away, and go for the same pattern to knight f6 and checkmate. So bishop b4 by Firouzja, h5, takes, and it looks like black has solved all of his problems. Right, I mean, he has won the exchange back, he's up a pawn, and what is there to be so concerned about? Well, if you move your knight out of the way, now white goes h6. Right, there's no things anymore in this diagonal. The move h6 really rips open black's king side. Because you can never take, because then comes a check, and this knight jumps in, the queen is coming in eventually. So you don't want to do this. So he goes for the move h6, but this also comes with some problems. Radjabov took, he took on g5, and now he takes on f7. And so here, if black takes on f7 with the rook, you take over here, and white is a pretty nice position. White's pawn structure is a lot better than black's. Black has 4 isolated pawns, while all of white's pawns are nicely connected. And the king of black is much more open than the white king on g1, which is sitting pretty safely. So he took with the king, knight takes g5 and king e8. So he feels like his king is sitting a lot safer in the center, which is probably true. So f3 by Radjabov, making sure g2 is not hanging. king to d7, and now a bit of a surprising decision. We were expecting that maybe, you know, he's gonna hop the knight around, but instead of that he goes knight to e4. Black has to take, you don't want to allow this knight to jump to c5, and he took with the rook, so he can go rook to g4 later on. Queen to d5 by Firouzja, creating a block in the center, queen b4, hitting the rook went to g8, and now queen a4. He's giving a check and going after the pawn on a7. So Firouzja played queen to c6, queen takes a7, and rook a8. And the queen is kind of trapped. Well, it's not really. The queen can still come out here, but here black can take and go king to c6. And you can really defend this pawn over here, because if you go rook c4, there's king to d5, and black is just too active. So instead of that, Radjabov went for active counterplay with the move rook to g4, hitting this pawn on g7. And here Firouzja made a surprising decision. I thought he should have just played rook g8, defend this pawn over here. There's rook g6, but we can take this pawn over here, and if you take, there's king d5, hitting the rook. And if white goes here, we can now start pushing our c-pawn. And if white brings the king up, there's a very nice move for black to draw. If white manages to connect the pawns, the endgame is very tricky. But we can play the move g5 to make sure that f4 is kind of not possible anymore. And if you get it with g3 and f4, then your pawns become targets, and also this pawn just keeps pushing down the board. So black should be able to draw here. But instead of that, Firouzja played king takes c5, rook takes g7, and king d5. So they're going into this endgame where white has a 2 versus 1 majority. Now if black moves his king back, it should be an easy draw. So Radjabov goes for the tricky rook to f7. He's cutting the king off first. And you guys might think like, okay, this is just an easy draw. The evil bar is in the middle. But if black does nothing here, he's going to lose. Like if you go rook b8, we bring the king up. And white goes g4, king g3. And that's white's idea. The king is cut off, and white can, you know, just keep pushing up the board here with king g3 and g5. And white is winning. So Firouzja had to do something in the meantime. So he goes for king d6, king f2, and now to move e5. An excellent move. He wants to go king e6, hit the rook, and bring his king back to defend. So g4 was played, king e6 and rook f5. And now once again, a very instructive moment. If black waits with the move rook b8, he's in a lot of danger after king g3. If white brings his king up, white has great winning chances, but he played the move rook to a3. And the point is that if we go king g3 now there's e4, you're trading everything down, and this is an easy draw for black. So white cannot do that, so instead of that, Radjabov played rook f8 first. Now you don't want to sit around with the move rook b3, because now white goes king g3. Because of e4, there's rook to e8, and you win this pawn on e4. So he went king to e7, rook to b8, but now he brings his king over to the king side. It's really this g-pawn that has to be under control. So black is able to draw here. So rook c8, king e7, rook c2, king f6. They're just shuffling around rook d3. Of course, he's not trading the rooks. Rook c2, rook a3, rook b2, check, king f7. Now, it's important to note that you never want to go king up, because white just goes here, and black is lost. Because if you defend, white can just take, check, take, and white has only one winning move here, which is the move king to h4. And you just outflank your opponent, and then you take the opposition. Alright, it's a very instructive king and pawn game. But of course, Firouzja doesn't go into that. He goes king f7, and they just keep waiting around. Not much happened here. They just shuffled back and forth to c2. And yeah, this is a pretty basic draw. So eventually, Radjabov does go for pawn to g5. Now another good defensive move by Firouzja. He's making sure that this king cannot step up, because he plays the move rook to a4. Rook f6. Now you don't want to go here, because then rook e6 will be annoying. You have to defend passively. So he goes to e7, rook h6, king f7, rook h4. Goes rook a5, a nice move. Rook king g4, he gave a check. King went here, and rook a3. Hitting his pawn. And there's no way for white to make progress. You go king g4, check, and king f5. There's a move. Rook to h4, so you cannot do that. So instead, he played f4, but now after pawn takes. Generally, a rook and pawn versus king endgame is an easy draw. The easiest way for black to draw this would be to put this rook on the 6th rank, and you just wait with your king over here. The king cannot step up, and if white goes g6, you go with the rook behind. The king cannot hide on the g6 square anymore, so black just gives an enormous amount of checks, and it's just a draw, which was the result of this game. So then the last game of this round was between Jan-Krzysztof Duda and Radjabov-Firouzja. So white opened the game with 1e4, and usually players in the candidates like to play solid, right? They like to play the Berlin or the Petrov or whatever. But Richard decided to play more originally with the move c5, knight f3, and e6. Just going for the timeout of defense. And after d4, takes, knight c6. Here the main move had always been the move knight to c3. But Duda goes for something completely different. He goes for bishop f4. And with this move, maybe he's going for a quick knight to b5, but Richard plays a pawn to d6. Maybe he wants to go for e5 in some positions. Duda trades and plays bishop to d3, knight e7, and c4 by Duda. And here Irene and I were commentating, and we thought that black has a pretty fine position after, let's say, knight to g6 and bishop e7. I mean, there's nothing really to be too concerned about. Or, you know, let's say c5 and knight c6, and black should be doing completely fine. But instead of that, Richard played the move g6, and this really started a lot of his problems. Duda found a very strong move c5. Now black's in danger, because if you take, there's bishop e5. Black has to move the rook, you cannot castle anymore. All of black's pawns are terrible. This knight e7 cannot go anywhere. So after something like queen c2, followed by castles and rook to d1, white has a great initiative. I mean, also this knight can start jumping around. So you don't want to do that. Instead of that, Richard played the move e5. Now came bishop g5. You still don't want to take because of bishop f6. And on top of all the problems I mentioned earlier, also going to be, you're not going to be up a pawn. It's a bishop g7 by Richard, but now he had to deal with this very ugly pawn structure. So castles, bishop to e6, knight a3 by Duda, and this is perhaps where he let Richard a bit off the hook. Maybe he should have played queen c2 followed by rook d1 first. But he played knight a3, rook to d8, and bishop e2. Alright, so Richard traded on d1 and takes. Maybe Duda should have taken here with a rook. I guess he was concerned about bishop takes a2, but white is a great initiative here, starting with a move like, let's say, knight b5. Because you cannot take, because you will get checkmated. And otherwise the knight just jumps into d6. So, but instead of that, Duda recaptured with the bishop, king to d7, and bishop e2. But it feels like white has lost a little bit of his initiative here. And he still has the better pawn structure, but that is not gonna win the game by itself, you know. But knight c8 by Richard, good move. Rook d1, king c7, bishop c4. Now he felt like trading down the light square bishops looked very unpleasant. So he played bishop g4, f3, and f6. A nice sequence to make sure that he can keep the bishops on the board and not lose his pawn on f7. The bishop dropped back, and now bishop at d7. Bishop e3, bishop e2 by Duda, h5, knight c2, bishop to f8. And slowly but surely, black is, getting back into the game. He's moving this bishop back. So a3, a5. He wants to make sure that knight b4 is not an option. That's also why he played this move. So king f1 by Duda, bishop e6, bishop d2, and king b6, knight e3, and knight d6. And around here, it felt like, Richard has done a really good job coming back into this game. I mean, his fellows are still a little bit weak, but it's not the end of the world if you can move his bishop out and then maybe bring his rook into the game. Black should be doing completely fine. So rook to c1 was played by Duda. Now here, probably bishop e7 should have been the move by Richard, but he played c5. Bishop to e1, bishop h6, rook d1, hitting the knight on d6. And here, Richard made a very weird decision. I felt like he should have just played the move king c6. Because now knight d5 doesn't really concern him. You can just take. And if white recaptures, you already have the very quick rook to d8 to create counterplay on the queen side. But instead of that, he played rook to d8. Now came knight d5, takes, and it feels like black just lost the tempo in a way. I mean, this rook on d8 is just passive. And black has a bit of a problem here. Like, it's difficult to make moves, because your king has to keep defending this pawn. Oh, sorry, this pawn over here. But he played the move bishop e3, and here Duda made a very weird decision. I thought during the game that after the move a4, white is simply winning. Because black is going to end up in Zug's one. You cannot move your king, then you hang this. I mean, you can move your knight, but white will go bishop c4. And if it gets into an endgame like this, black is simply running out of moves. Let's say after move b3. This knight can never move, because it will allow bishop to f7, and you're going to lose your kingside pawns. Your king cannot move. Your bishops, I mean, you can put the bishop here, but it's not doing much. And in the meantime, white can go for something like h4 and g4. And in that case, white will get an outside passer, which is simply going to run down the board. So I thought a4 was simply winning for Duda. But instead of that, he played rook to d3, now came bishop d4, check, and king c6. And he felt like, okay, it looks straight for white, right? You win a pawn, but black gets a ton of counterplay in return. Rook to 8 was played. Now came a check, king d7. And, you know, you can move your bishop back, but all of the pieces feel pretty awkward, right? Black can play something like king c7. The rook has to go here, and now c4. So this is probably not what Duda wanted. So he played rook a6, but now this allows black to capture this pawn on b2. And the material is equal. So c4 now by Richard. Bishop b4 by Duda. h4. Black doesn't have to be too concerned about this opposite color bishop endgame. It feels like black should be able to draw this quite comfortably with only one pawn down. So Duda decides to keep the pieces on the board with king e2, king c6, and bishop a5. He wants to make sure that king to b6 is not a move. So Richard played bishop c1, bishop d8, and bishop g5. Now king d1 by Duda. He wants to bring his king around to the queen side. King d7, bishop e6, and king c6. Rapport is chasing this bishop around. a5, bishop f4. A tricky little move, because, I mean, you can play h3, but now your entire structure on the king side is frozen. So Duda decided to just sacrifice that pawn on the king side. f5 by Richard. King c3. And now black took on e4. And I gave a check, and now he took on h2. So black is up a pawn, but white is still a little bit better, because he has the two bishops. This a pawn is more dangerous than black's pawns, which are not really going anywhere for the moment. The bishops are doing a good job of controlling them. So bishop e2, e4, and bishop c5. And if white gets in, let's say a6, a7, white has great chances to win, but the problem is black can always do something to stop that. So Richard played knight f5, trying to go bishop d6. So bishop e5 check was played, king c7, bishop b6, king b7, and bishop c4. Now, once again, white would like to step up with the king somehow and go for a6. But black first went knight d6, bishop b2, and king c6. So it's really difficult to get in that a6 push. So bishop c5, now knight f5. He once again wants to trade off these bishops with bishop d6. And Duda realized that there isn't really much here, so he gave a check, king c7, and now a6. So this allows Richard to trade the bishops with bishop d6, a7. He traded off the bishops. And now king d7, and black simply captures this pawn. White gave a check, takes, and took an e4. But there's simply not enough pieces left on the board. So Richard just went knight e3, captured the last white pawn, and now the game ended in a draw. So that wraps up the first round of the candidates. After this first round, Nepomniachtchi and Fabiano Caruana are in the lead. In shared third place, we have Jan-Krzysztof Duda and Radjabov-Firouzja, and Teimour, Radjabov, and Alireza. And in 7th place on 0 points, we have Liren and Hikaru-Nakamura, who had a bit of a tough start. So, tough start for Hikaru in this candidates, but fortunately for him, it's still a very long tournament. He's playing tomorrow with the white piece against Radjabov. Maybe he can come back in that round. But in any case, I hope you guys enjoyed the video, and I look forward to seeing you guys in round number 2 of the FIDE candidates tournament.